अस्सलाम वालेकुम जी, वेलकम टू सिया। हमने आपको पता है सिया में वी ट्राइंग टू स्टार्ट नेशनल कन्वर्सेशन एज ऑलवेज, जो पाइड में पिछले 5 साल किया है, तो हम कोशिश कर रहे हैं यहाँ कंटिन्यू करने का। नेशनल कन्वर्सेशन हमारे मुल्क में होती कोई नहीं, सिर्फ एक ही लड़ाई झगड़े की होती है और कुछ नहीं। तो हम कोशिश करें कंस्ट्रक्टिव कन्वर्सेशन। तो उसमें आज आई एम वेरी ग्लैड टू ब्रिंग एन ओल्ड फ्रेंड, वन ऑफ द मोस्ट वेल नोन ऑथर्स इन पाकिस्तान, वेल नोन पर्सनैलिटी इन अ वेरी स्पेसिफिक एरिया। अभी आपको पता चल जाएगा। Shuja Nawaz Sahab, I think you've all heard of him. He's written 2 or 3 books, very authoritative and definitive books on the Pakistan Army. He's also been an IMF staff member for many years. He's also managed the Finance and Development magazine of the fund, a prominent member of the External Relations Department of the fund. Extensive journalistic experience. I think he started off as a newscaster on PTV in the good old days of PTV, and a very well-known author. Researcher. So Shuja Nawaz, welcome to our show or our podcast. Shuja Sahab, the reason I called you, and I think it's a very important subject. I think I can't think of a better person to talk about it than you. जो हमारे मुल्क में ये permanent conflict है, political conflict, जिसके अंदर फौज, जिसको हम establishment कहते हैं, आ जाती है. How do you've studied this a lot. I want you to, if possible, I know it's a very big subject for you. Can you summarize it for us? कि क्या है कि हम क्यों बार बार इस चीज में फंस जाते हैं कि political settlement हमारे मुल्क में होती कोई नहीं. सब sides मेरा ख्याल इसमें कमजोर हैं. But I won't prejudge the question. Please बताइए आपका क्या ख्याल है, क्यों? Why do we keep failing in this area?
One of the things that worries me about Pakistan, has always worried me, is that it's still a very young country, and it has had a very traumatic early life. And people in Pakistan received this country without the kind of effort that many other people in other parts of the world had to make in order to create their own nation states. I think of places like Algeria, for instance, where there was a long and bloody fight against a colonial power. In Pakistan, this was not the case. And in Pakistan, if you go back to the history, the military was not involved in the formation of the state. The military was basically part of the British Empire under British control, and was kept far away from civilian life. As you know, even now we have cantonments that are perhaps more permeated now by civilians, but there was a time when I was growing up, and I come from a military family, where there was a big divide between the city and the chowni, the cantonment. And so that was one of the initial weaknesses of the foundations of the country. Secondly, as you know well, because of your family background and because you've looked at this issue also, we had a large influx of people who were committed to this country, who came in from India, from British India, and then settled in different areas of Pakistan. These were the outsiders. And they were the more educated, often the more adventurous, like any group in any country, in any history, who make a trek to find a new life in a new place. They were the people that worked harder, perhaps, than the locals, for whom Pakistan was just a given. It was an entitlement that they received without making any effort. And so there was a conflict between the locals and the outsiders. And that has permeated the society ever since. The other thing, and this is the part that worries me the most, is that we assume that because we grew up and were born in a country called Pakistan, and that it was created in the name of Islam, using, it was the land of the pure, but it was an acronym which missed out on a very key part of the country that was created. There is nothing representing East Pakistan that became Bangladesh in the acronym that is Pakistan. And that may be a portent of what was to come. And it was only 24 years before the death of Jinnah's Pakistan occurred. And we have to recognize that reality. This is what pains me, that we don't realize that states have come and gone from the map of the world. I mean, behind me, you see the remnants of my library after downsizing, and I have a small collection of old atlases that I look at periodically. And in those atlases, I find countries coming and going, breaking up in pieces, being renamed, being occupied, and then creating a new identity. And so that is what's the part that worries me about Pakistan, that the question of state death, which we have already experienced once in 1971, is something that we should worry about. That's at a very broad.
But tell me, let's dig deeper into it. I remember the old Hamza Alawi thesis, which said that the state in post-colonial societies is overgrown and over-colonialized, etc., and that it does not match our political development and it does not match our cultural development. I think that has exhibited itself very well. Let me say, our state seems to be, or our administrative state or our military bureaucratic state seems to be totally out of sync with our local environment. But secondly, related, and they've been trying to find an Islamic way of pulling us together, which unfortunately half happens, half doesn't happen. But a bigger question is, our political class seems to be totally immature. They can't seem to take any decisions. And I'm reminded of again, many people, etc., talk about it, that maybe the landed class, which was basically canal colony, settlers, sardars or zemindars that were created by the British Empire, they were not capable of inheriting the state. But then that begs the question: is India better than us? So how do you react to all this?
I think first of all, you're quite right that you have to recognize that there is a role of the landed gentry. And as you know, particularly in the largest province of the country, the Punjab, they were in fact opposed to the creation of Pakistan. In fact, the Unionist Party, by its very name, didn't want to break away from the Union, the Indian Union. And so that was one conflict that occurred. And as you know, when Liaquat Ali was assassinated, that was never resolved as to who was behind that. And there were all kinds of insinuations and allegations that perhaps it was the insiders that wanted to retain their control that had somehow found a third party to do the deed for them. At that time, the military was not involved in any of these machinations. The military started getting into it around that time and after Ayub Khan took over in 1953. And so there is an issue, obviously, of a conflict between the privileged class, the elite, as we know it, and that persists. They've expanded their club so that it's no longer a handful of families. It is now includes people who've made their money elsewhere or through other means and are now incorporated in this, and through intermarriages amongst themselves as well as with the military. Over time, that has changed the ruling elites in Pakistan. But that's just one of the issues. I think the question of using Islam as a political scotch tape, to borrow a phrase that my friend Khalid Hassan once used in terms of Pakistani politics, this political scotch tape failed to keep the country together when there were two wings of the country. And we never learned that lesson. In fact, this is my heartbreak as somebody who keeps looking at history, that we don't want to look at our history with a deep dive so that we can understand what happened and whether we can avoid making the mistakes of the past. Let me just digress here, Nadeem, and share with you and your audience that I'm now working on a new book, which is looking at what I call the death of Jinnah's Pakistan and the birth of Bangladesh. There's no formal title yet, but this is the thesis that I'm examining. And I'm looking at what were the cumulative issues of governance, inequality, centralized control, problems between the center and the periphery, language issues, cultural issues, and then natural and man-made disasters that led to the breakup of Jinnah's Pakistan. And I use 1971 as a hinge point because for me, that was very personal. I was then covering that conflict for Pakistan television, including the war on the Western Front. And so in this process, I'm discovering much more of these hidden weaknesses, the fissures that exist in Pakistani state. It's not Pakistani society. Let me just say this. Pakistan has been kept afloat by the vast majority of Pakistanis who are doing their work, who go to their fields, who go to the factories, who are sending their children abroad to work in the Gulf and in Europe and in America. And the $31 billion a year that you well know that has kept Pakistan afloat because it was a direct transfer and the government had nothing to do with it, except maybe put up obstacles in the way of getting the money to and from the country. So the country survives in spite of government. And I think that is one lesson that I get out of all of this. Of course, you are there, you're keeping an eye on the changing demographics. And another worrying trend that bothers me is that the rise of the middle class, which was evident a few years ago, has apparently been dealt a blow by COVID and natural disasters and so many other things. And so I recall there used to be a figure of about 50 plus million who were supposed to be in the middle class with a PPP-based per capita income of $10,000 a year, which is a substantial market for goods from overseas and for investors and so on. And now it is, I'm told, closer to 22 million. If this is true, then that is a hole that Pakistan needs to dig itself out of, because this was kind of the natural process by which it was surviving in spite of bad governance.
But you see, think about it another way. We are the richer part of the subcontinent. And we in Pakistan, we especially feel proud at dinner tables and, those drawing room conversations. We say, look at those Indians, they're so poor. We talk about the railway tracks in Bombay, and we talk about the Indians who are sort of sleeping on the streets, etc. In Pakistan, one thing is clear: we are not, we don't have abject poverty of the kind that we see in India. But on the other hand, that I also see, which is also very remarkable, is we don't have a political consensus on economics. We just don't have a political consensus. As you said, we use the Scotch tip of Islam. But on political consensus, which is what is amazing, and maybe you should talk about this too, we have spent the last 77 years in an IMF program. The IMF as well as anybody else, in fact, better than most people. We have had 25 programs with the IMF in 77 years. And as you recall, IMF programs last at least for 1, 2, 3 years, and the borrowing period is 5 years at the minimum. So if you think about it, that we've been in a fund program almost throughout our history. And that just shows another way of looking at it, that we just don't have a consensus on economics. We go to the IMF. The other thing that I find amazing is we keep going out to borrow, whether it's dictatorship or whether it's democracy. We are always begging. We're always begging. And this stems back to what I think about, and you know this very well. In the old days, Mahbub Haque, whom you knew very well, he and the Howard Advisory Group put us on the track of projects and borrowing. And we can't seem to get out of it. We seem to be stuck in that conundrum. We seem to be stuck in Islam. And no matter who comes in, whether it's the military or the civilian side, a consensus doesn't change. It's the Scotch tip of Islam and the bandit of the IMF. What do you think?
Well,
Is that does
let
that
me,
come?
Nadeem, let me push back a little on a couple of the things that you said. One, Mehboob Haq, with whom, as you know, I had a very long relationship. And in fact, in '82, when he decided to go back to take over the planning ministry and the planning commission and to prepare for the sixth five-year plan for Pakistan, he asked me to accompany him, and I refused because I didn't want to work for a military dictatorship. So he arranged for UNDP to bring me in as a consultant, and so I worked with him on a study on economic information flows and how to structure the planning commission's messaging so that people could understand what the plan was about. And we arranged for him to talk to people, including talk to the military about what was being done and why it was being done, and answer all their questions. And it worked to some extent. But earlier on, Mehboob did push for growth, which is something that you also are pushing for. And I agree with that approach. The other point I would say is that if you recall, during the period when Ghulam Ishaq Khan was the finance minister, and he was also co-chairing the development committee, and I used to work quite closely with him at that time. He was one of the few finance ministers in the developing world who actually did not go out to borrow. That was a period that Pakistan survived a lot of the difficulties that the other countries, even in Southeast Asia, that were doing very well, and East Asia that were doing very well, ran into difficulties because of their borrowing. And he managed to keep things on an even keel. But you're absolutely right. The borrowing part is part of it, has become part of the psyche. That if you can borrow, you can live large and then let the next lot take care of it. What they don't realize is that with Pakistan's growing population, they're going to burden the future generations with the payment of these debts. Their children and grandchildren, or the children and grandchildren of the vast majority of the population, will be bearing that heavy weight of the debt, because these people who are making these decisions will have left the country and settled abroad, which many of them have done partially already. So that is, I entirely agree with you on that part of your statement, that the debt burden is thoughtless and unproductive. The other thing, of course, is the expenditure part, which we have to take into account, because unproductive expenditure at home. Again, I'm for you. I'm preaching to the choir. The unproductive expenditure, including on defense, including on real estate, doesn't yield the kind of benefits to a country like Pakistan. And other countries have found a way to balance those expenditures. Now, there is a danger.
Let me take you in another direction. Let me build on something that you said. You talked about intermarriages and the elite expanding. Now, there's a woman that we called, she wrote a book, Big Capital. I don't know if you saw it or not. This book is, she was an anthropologist who came and lived in Pakistan, and we called her over, and she did a seminar for us. She talks about two things that are important and that I wish you to comment on. One is the rent-seeking culture in Pakistan, where she said that these people don't do any work; they just try and cook deals. She talked about the clubs, she talked about weddings, she talked about parties. She said all these deals are cooked up out there, and she talked about this elite class that is kind of intermarried and very close to each other, so that you can see. I don't want to take names, but you can see one judge, one brother is the judge, another judge, another person is the general, another whatever, so they're interlinked. But so tell me, this is part of our feudal culture. Fair enough. We understand that. That's the way we grew up, and that's the way it happened. But one thing that is clearly a departure between India and us is the rent-seeking culture. and is the culture where we have a huge showing off culture, whereas India, as you know, doesn't. And this thing about somehow this plots perks culture that I call it, that plots perks protocol, for example, even a judge now has 3 cars following him and 3 cars in front of him. Even a bureaucrat has these things. Every bureaucrat has a car. Everybody gets plots, and everybody shows off their cars and plots. Like day before yesterday on Twitter, there was a senator from Sindh who was showing off his huge car collection. How do you, is that who we are, or is that something we acquired, or has it expanded a lot, or does it affect anything?
This is a symptom of the lack of an organized economic and political system. Everyone for himself. As the French phrase goes, sauve qui peut. Everyone for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. And on this basis, you want to make your money quickly, you take shortcuts, you don't want to make the heavy investments. Yes, there are areas in which, and I hate to try and stay with this comparison between India and Pakistan, because they're really very two different worlds. I've traveled extensively in India. I know India quite well. I've traveled in the north and the south, and I've talked to the business people there. India changed dramatically, but it didn't escape the evils of market economics as we know it, because the deal making that you're talking about in Pakistan occurs in India too. There's bribery, there's corruption. It happens in the United States. There's bribery, there's corruption, even in Congress. So no country and no society is immune.
But would you say there's a difference of degree or not?
There is a difference of degree, because there is an investment in the country and in the economy, which in this case, to take the comparison of India and Pakistan, I think the image of broken down Indian railroads is no longer accurate. India now has one of the fastest developing infrastructure in the world. And if you recall, about 10 years ago, the Chinese had offered to build this superhighway system, triangular system connecting all of India, and the Indians did it themselves. And they now are going for better quality rail, which they do have, and high-speed rail. And once they have that, then that will form an economic network for them, and it'll help with integration also among particularly the north and the south, because the south is the more prosperous part of the country as we know it. But they've also invested heavily in education, and yet you're quite right, because of the size of their economy. It's now the largest population in the world, 1.4 billion, and growing. They do still have a middle class, which is over 300 million. So that is roughly the population of the US or of Europe. And so it's a very rich country. Now, my view is that Pakistan's strength really lies in its people and in its middle class, and it lies in building an education system that is world class. Because on that basis, it can employ the youth of Pakistan, who are the majority of the population of the country. Our population pyramid is not that traditional pyramid. It is almost upside down. So you have to sort of take into account that the youth are now a huge part of that pyramid.
But tell me, you have been publishing books, and you are, mashallah, a very well-known author, and even in Pakistan. But are you happy with the sale of your books? Or, as I have seen, for example, bookshops are dying in Pakistan, and very few people read here. There's hardly an intellectual climate here. Would you say that the strength of Pakistan is still its people? Because the people, the more I see them, the more they're uneducated. And the more I see them, for example, Ataur Rahman, mashallah, killed a university system where everybody's got a PhD now. So we don't even know who's who. Everybody's got fake publication. Everybody's got. So people are resting on this fact that, hey, I've got a fake publication, I've got a fake degree, and that's fine. And everybody respects that. The government also respects that. Government tells me, I don't know the difference between an MBA from Harvard and an MBA from the Alson College. So, I mean, how do you reconcile that again? Are we a people who are really, I mean, let me frame it differently. Culture, for example, lots of people say culture is very important. I mean, my former professor, Deirdre McCloskey, she also came and talked to us. She's written a whole book on bourgeois values, bourgeois dignity, and she says it's a value system that drove the English Industrial Revolution. It's a value system that brought England to rule the world. Do we have a value system that's for growth and that's forward-looking?
Well, culture and values evolve over time. I think this is a natural progression, and it occurs not because of governments, but in spite of governments.
Yep.
And to go back to your initial question about book sales and so on, when I wrote my first book, Cross Swords, Pakistan, its Army, and the Wars Within, I did that because I had been working on that book for more than 30 years.
I remember.
And I had wanted to do that not in order to achieve any purpose other than to help people understand a very important institution in Pakistan, an institution that I knew from the inside, and where I looked at other countries and wanted to apply the lessons that I'd learned from other countries, particularly countries like Indonesia, which needs to be studied by people in Pakistan much more than it is. And so just to give you one instance, all these ills that you're talking about are very easily changed and removable. They don't have deep roots because they are put on top of Pakistani society, and they're smothering Pakistani society. So you remember the Asian financial crisis of '98. That prompted a complete rethink and a revolution in politics in that part of the world, in Southeast Asia. And if you remember, I used to then work at the IMF Institute, and I was setting up the Regional Training Center in Singapore. So I used to travel frequently to the region. And that is when Indonesia elected an honest politician, a man named Abdul Wahid, as the president. And because the country was in a deep economic funk, he managed to use that opportunity to recast their whole political system. And it didn't take very long. Within a matter of weeks, he took away the entitlements of ABRI, which was the acronym for the military complex that ruled the country as a shadow government, took away their entitlements, their golf courses, their privileges, and he basically sent them back to the barracks. And they stayed there till the recent election of a former general who is now trying to form political alliances to bring back the military influence in some way. But Indonesia's success was something that intrigued me and is worth looking at and emulating for countries like Pakistan. I also studied Nigeria, which, as you know, had a series of coups.
Right.
After 1961, when they had their first coup, when the first civilian Prime Minister, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, was overthrown by then Captain Yakubu Gowon. Now, I have a personal connection with Gowon, which is one place removed, that he was at Sandhurst with my late brother Asif. And they were on the boxing team at Sandhurst together. And Yakubu Gowon became a colonel and then a general after he took over, while my brother was still a major. And I used to joke with him that, he was left behind. So Nigeria suffered a series of coups, again, because they didn't set up a structure that took the power away from the military and gave it to the people, gave them an opportunity to elect the right leaders and keep them in place. And Nigeria, despite its wealth, which you well know, has never really come out of the poverty trap. So there are lessons to be learned. I am an eternal optimist, particularly when it comes to Pakistan, because I believe fervently that if you let the people alone, if you let the young people alone, if you don't impose restrictions on them, then they will come up with solutions that will astound you. The growth of the programming software industry, for instance, the small companies that have sprouted out of people's bedrooms and backyards in Pakistan that are serving large corporations around the world. Young men and women are working nights because that gives them the time difference advantage, and making $4,000 and $5,000 a month was unimaginable when you and I were growing up in Pakistan. And look what the government is trying to do. I regret that in the name of security, the control of the internet is going to hamper Pakistan's growth prospects, particularly into the service industry.
But tell me, some would say that the difference between Nigeria, Indonesia, and us is the fact that we live in a difficult part of the world and that our borders are totally insecure and that we have to play a role in geopolitics. We played a role in the Cold War. We played a role in the Afghan War. I want to ask you two questions. One is, how much agency did we have in the Cold War, in the Afghan War? Could we have done something different? Could we have, for example, joined the non-aligned states or not fought the Afghan War? Do we still need to kind of back off from Kabul? So we got a problem with none better than you to talk about that policy. We got a deep problem with the Afghan policy as well as the India policy. Are we a security state out of choice, or are we a security state because of the neighborhood? And if we are a security state, do we have better options than what we do now, or are our options severely restricted?
Nadeem, as you know, this was the subtitle of my last book.
Yeah.
The Battle for Pakistan, the bitter US friendship and a tough neighborhood. And way back, I'll take you back to our days at the IMF, when Mohammed Finesh, who used to represent Pakistan, approached me once because he had to defend Pakistan in the executive board. And this was before you joined him as his advisor. He asked me if I could help him draft a statement that could push back on the pressure that was being put on Pakistan. And that is when I wrote a paragraph for him about Pakistan living in a dangerous neighborhood. And so I'm very familiar with it. But the problem with geography is that you can't change geography. My friend Bruce Rydell, who was at Brookings and then was an advisor to Obama and did his Afghanistan review, said to me once, he said, if you took Pakistan and lifted it from its current position and put it where Uruguay is, no one would worry about Pakistan. So that's a reality that Pakistan can deal with. Now, to answer your question, does Pakistan have agency? Yes, always has agency. But it is the leadership at the time when the crisis occurs on the borders that makes those decisions. And now let's look at the two critical phases that got us involved in the first Afghanistan war, the Soviet jihad, as I call it, and then the second Afghanistan war. At the time of the first war, Zia-ul Haq was being ostracized by the international community for having overturned an elected government of Pakistan and for having then executed former Prime Minister of Pakistan. And it gave him an opportunity of negotiating a deal that would not only keep him going, but also receive largesse. And then he took the most fateful steps, which was to bring the inter-services intelligence front and center into the power structure of the country. This was an organization that was very professional, very small, and very effective, particularly vis-a-vis India in terms of counterintelligence, in terms of penetration of Indian society and military and getting information that would help defend Pakistan. It became a very political institution. It became the tool for him to manage the Afghan war. And then emerged a mindset because of the creation of the Afghan cell, which was military dominated, where the whole idea was to create a kind of a colonial client state in Afghanistan using money and weaponry as an influence. Because the basic rules that he agreed with the United States was that the US couldn't directly supply anything to the Mujahideen. It had to be done through the military, and in the military, it was the ISI's responsibility. And so that changed the whole equation within the military and within Pakistan. And since then, the inter-services intelligence and the establishment as we know it in Pakistan has never looked back. Remember also that the majority of the regular army of Pakistan was not involved in the Afghanistan conflict. A Corps headquarters was set up, 12th Corps in Quetta, simply as a defensive mechanism in case the Soviets broke through and sideswiped Pakistan on their way to the Gulf, which was one of the theories that was put forward for the case of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So that was Ziaul Haq and his decision that brought Pakistan into conflict in the region with Afghanistan. With Iran, there's been always a hot and cold relationship. And that became more fraught after 79 with the Islamic Revolution, when the US and US supported groups began using Pakistani territory as a base for launching operations into Iran. And this has happened till very recent times, despite Pakistan's protestations that it is not occurring. And that Iran has been accusing Pakistan of allowing its soil to be used by these groups, like Jundullah. And so that hot and cold relationship remains. With India, the conflict is not just Kashmir, but it is the conflict of a much larger superpower, emerging superpower, and a small state which can only strengthen itself if it improves its economy and its society. It cannot be done on a military scale, and that is a reality that Pakistan needs to face. If you remember, at the time of Obama's second term, the National Intelligence Council of the United States produced a report which the Atlantic Council helped with. And I was part of the team that also went abroad with the draft. And I shared that draft with General Kiani because I wanted him to understand that one of the future conflicts that we saw festering was India and Pakistan. But a key element that I remember he took notes when I pointed it out to him was that at that time, India's economy was 7 to 9 times the size of Pakistan. By 2030, our estimate was that India's economy would be 16 times the size of Pakistan. And that difference would not allow any kind of military equilibrium between the two states. So Pakistan's defense posture had to shift. It has to shift if it's going to prevent India from dominating it and walking in at will. It has to have a much more leaner and meaner force, not one relying on size alone, which has been the trend even after we lost half the country. It has to be mobile, it has to be highly trained, highly educated, and use all elements, including technology, in order to be able to fend off any adverse actions or reactions from India to what happens on that border. The only border that has remained relatively calm is the China-Pakistan border. But there are issues there. As you know, the Chinese have constantly complained that there were elements in Pakistan that were using erstwhile Fatah as a training ground for the freedom fighters, the Uyghurs. And Pakistan and its leadership refuses to talk about that issue, refuses to understand that issue, while promising the Chinese that they will seal the border and the movement of forces. But I don't know if they have the capacity to be able to do that. And that remains an issue. Of course, with Afghanistan now in total disarray, it is almost impossible to know whom to talk to in Afghanistan. But Pakistan has to protect its borders. I believe, and I may be stretching my neck out on this, that our current approach, which we have been following for the past decade plus, in using a leading military edge to fight this menace of terrorism in the border areas of Balochistan and Pakistan, is basically misdirected. That you can make the changes, address the issues that are within those areas to give those people voice and participation, particularly the youth. And I remember at the time when we did our calculations, Khalid Ikram helped me with this number. There were 300,000 male youth in erstwhile Fatah between the ages of 16 and 25. If we had only created job opportunities for them when we started building infrastructure in Fatah, instead of just giving it to FWO alone and bringing in people from the rest of the country to do the work, and to maintain those roads, we could have made a dent in the unhappiness.
This brings me to a very important question, Shuja. I mean, I think you painted the picture beautifully, and you say that we have some agency, and you talk about the fact that we need to develop our economy because that's the only weapon that we've got. And you said in the Atlantic Council report, you noted this fact that the disparities are growing at a very rapid level. But the tragedy is, I do not think that we have economic growth or the economy in mind at all. That's why I come back to my earlier question. There are two things. One, we think that we are a very strange welfare state, where the term that we use all the time in politics is give relief and give things to people. We don't talk about creating an economy where there's economic growth. For example, one thing that I keep talking about, I did some research on this, that look, we don't have any companies of any size, which surprises me. Our companies, I think we've only got about 4 or 5 companies that are bigger than $1 billion market cap. And they're also mostly owned by the government or multinationals or something. Local companies, I think only 2 banks that are above $1 billion, and maybe Engro is above $1 billion. The rest are all very small. So our companies are not growing, our exports are not growing, and yet we want to be a big muscle security state. And related to that also, I want to throw this at you. You studied this well. Who makes these policies in our country, like foreign policy, security policy, economic policy? I honestly don't understand how these policies are made. They're made. I don't understand how they're made. You talked about the ISI or the security state. Sometimes we get the feeling out here that most of the policies, most of the things that happen in Pakistan are conspiracies. So in another sense, we'd call Pakistan a conspiracy land. I mean, it kind of furtively happens. It's not openly, as you said. You prepared a National Intelligence Council report, all those things come out. Here, policy documents seldom come out. When laws are passed, they're passed at the last minute and they come as a surprise to us, like the 26th Amendment or something. So comment on the lack of economic thinking and the lack of any priority making in Pakistan. And especially, how do these priorities get made? Is it just conspiracies? Do we have, let's say, for example, the establishment is a big source. Do they have any thinking in the establishment, or is it just the top man who thinks, like you mentioned about Zia? Is it just whims of the big people, or is there a proper process that happens?
Well, it's both. Let me put it that way. And just to complete that earlier story, The second big intervention in Afghanistan was under Musharraf. He was also ostracized for having overthrown a duly elected Prime Minister of Pakistan. And he was faced with the prospect of either saying yes to the list of 17 demands that the United States put forward, that Wendy Chamberlain handed to him, or suffering the fate that he knew awaited him if he said no. And it was only 2 days after having said yes that he brought his corps commanders together at Rawalpindi and briefed them on what he had done to justify what he had done, that he had no other choice but to say yes to the United States. And I've covered that extensively in my book, The Battle for Pakistan, because without Pakistan's help, Afghanistan's invasion could not have taken place. I think for those that have read the book and you talk about book sales, I remember my book launches were cancelled by the then army chief because
I remember that. Yeah, of course.
He thought that the book launches would provide a platform for discussion of his extension, which was then before the Supreme Court, which unfortunately was completely untrue, because the particular para in the book that irked him was the one where I actually said that a false accusation had been leveled against him of belonging to a minority sect in Pakistan. So Musharraf took the decision and put Pakistan in. When people don't read, as you say, they don't understand. And when they don't understand, they keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Now, I don't like to just complain and say everything's bad and woe is me and that's the end of it. I like to see what are the opportunities. And so the two words that I use as the key on which any country, and particularly Pakistan, can build its future is transparency and accountability. And that has to apply. You can't just talk about it. It has to apply to all the institutions of Pakistani society, civil and military. It has to apply in our family life. It has to apply in our civil society. It has to apply in the political system. And it has to apply to the military also. When I look at the history of the country, and I've been doing that, and I'm still doing it, I find particularly hinge points where we had an opportunity to break that cycle of avoiding the truth. We had commissions that were set up investigating key events, including assassinations, murders, whatever, in the country, investigating the war of 71, for instance. And those reports were taken away from public view, and some were destroyed completely. So the fact that the Hamudur Rahman Commission report came out of the underground, and that the Afghanistan Commission, the Abbottabad Commission report was also leaked in an earlier draft, and that was it. People don't know what happened and why it happened, and a lot of very useful testimony occurred, including from the head of the ISI about the Abbottabad Commission, and that should have seen the light of day. But there is a fear, and this is not just in Pakistan, but in all autocracies throughout the world, that if the people find out, then the whole system will collapse. And that's true, because it is a house of cards. As we saw in Syria recently, all it took was a timely intervention, and the whole system just collapsed and imploded. And so that is the fear that drives the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability. If you go back and you look, how many trials have taken place where people have been convicted and the information has been shared with the population? Trials of senior people in the civil and in the military. The information is kept secret as if it will destroy the society or destroy the institution. I happen to believe that these institutions are much stronger. They are kept alive by professionals who do their jobs, who get up every morning and go to work and put in a full day's work, an honest day's work. It is only
You mentioned
the elite. It's only the elite that profit from it. And you remember 2 years ago, the UNDP report said that the elite capture in Pakistan is 17.4 billion annually.
Yeah. But tell me, you mentioned two words, transparency and accountability. I find another word in Pakistan totally missing, which is merit. Do you think this merit here? And I find also that it's very clear by our policies. We tend to push out all talented people from Pakistan and we almost give them a one-way ticket and never call them back. And if somebody comes back, like Mahbubullah came back, we never treated him well. We kind of threw him out again. We've also treated Abdul Salam and many others very bad, very shabbily. Do you think we respect merit? There is a huge story here also that the army is merit-based. I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it is merit-based. But if it is, then I don't know. Who does the thinking? I come back to the same question. Is there enough research in Pakistan to make our policy? Or are we just winging it?
Let me just address the things that I know, which is I've studied the military and I've studied the training institutions, I've studied their processes. And there are obviously people within the military who know much, much more than I do. I'm simply an amateur who's interested in these things. Or maybe trying to fulfill that secret desire of not having joined the military. I want to pay my debt. But the military does have a system of training which doesn't end. Unlike the civil service, for instance, which you know well, which you grew up in. In the civil service, you go to the Civil Services Academy and that is your ticket. There is some nominal training later on, but it's basically a time to just relax and take a few months off and then come back to move on to the next post. There's very little formalized, regular, wide-scale, wide-based training which prepares people and specializes them for duties. It's still a very general approach.
But also, don't forget, it's a closed system. You can't get fresh people.
No. Well, Bhutto tried the lateral entries, and it was like the body defense mechanism attacking the antibodies. So they were expelled. But that is one way of creating a class where within the civil service and the systems you can bring in professionals, and there are still attempts being made, but only at the upper level. And as you know, the real work is done in the trenches. People at section officer level and below are the ones who are actually preparing the notes and doing the thinking. And then you bring in consultants and academics. And I disagree with you on one point, which is Pakistan still has a lot of talent. The fact that you're sitting in Pakistan and the work that you've done over your lifetime, the people that you worked with at the University of Chicago, from whom you learned, people like Becker, who broke boundaries and did things that other economists refused to look at. I mean, think about somebody saying, I want to study the economics of love. You would be laughed out of court. So there are people there. It's just a question of creating the opportunities for them and benefiting from them and not to fear them.
So what is it that you think is missing? What do you think is missing? How do we create opportunities for talent to come to the right place? I struggle with this because
as I said, I was looking at the military as an example. They have at different levels exams and courses and so on, and conceded that there has been ample evidence that there's a fair amount of cheating that goes on. There is a culture of what is known as the staff solution, where the closer you come to the answer that the instructors have thought of, the better you are. And that harms any military in the long run, because when you study military history and strategy, you discover that the most successful military commanders are the ones who think outside the box. They're not the ones who follow the rules. So an encouragement of creative thinking within the military would also be a major plus for the military. The other thing is that you have to expose the military to training outside the military. And that is done very sparingly. I've seen it, I've been in the United States since 72, off and on. And so I've come to know people who were in the military and then went and did a PhD at Harvard or Princeton or somewhere, got a chance to develop their intellectual abilities, look at issues from a different perspective, and come back and use that information for management of the military. And they became four-star generals. So I think within the military, there's a lot of scope for that also. But it's the only institution currently that has a system of training, courses, selection boards, and so on. Now, conceded as in any institution, and even in the United States, there is favoritism. There are people that have served together that promote each other, or people from their service group or from their regiment. But compared to the other groups within Pakistani society, the military has the edge. And it uses that edge and it uses its discipline in order to assert its will on other systems that are willing to bend and break when it comes to deal making. And they now have the resources because, as you know, instead of veterans administration in the government, the military has created its own veterans administration system through the Army Welfare Trust and the Fauji Foundation and the other service foundations. I happen to think that these are a drag on the military, and they take away a lot of the ability of the military to grow and become leaner and meaner. Also, the induction of military officers in civilian posts, particularly serving officers, I think does more damage to the military than it helps. It's fine to be able to be there and control things and so on, but it's very short term, in my view, and it can do long-term damage to any institution when it moves off from its main purpose.
No, I think that's a very fair analysis, and I appreciate that, but I still don't see. Just look at the US, for example. If you look at the whole paraphernalia of the US military, they have, for example, West Point, they have the Center for Naval Analysis, they've got Rand Corp, they've got so many corporations, DARPA, so many things that are actually doing the thinking for the military and technologically advancing the military. There's a huge enterprise that's going on. Pakistan has also tried some of that. We made the JF Thunder, we made defense production things, etc. But I still think that somehow, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the military is not grappling with the major problem of Pakistan, which is as you said, set up a transparent and a good political system. They should be able to do it if they have the thought and clarity. I'm not saying, in fact, I'm one of the guys who would say, we don't want the army out of politics. We don't want to downsize the army, etc. But we want them to actually help in growing the system. And I don't want any half-baked solution, but let the military be in there, but have a political settlement where we can have something working half and half. The second thing that I also would like to point out, which is also very important, economics has been an underbelly. You talked to the Bangladesh and you're doing a book on that, etc. But if you recall, I remember PIDE of my younger days, when the Bengalis took over PIDE, before I joined PIDE, when the Bengalis took over PIDE, and the Bengalis actually laid the foundation, I'm sure it's going to come out in your book, foundation for Bangladesh in PIDE, where they actually talked about the adverse terms of trade for Bangladesh, where they talked about different levels of investment in Bangladesh and in this side of Pakistan, and the 22 families, etc. Now we are seeing a similar story play out, and I'm watching this helplessly. I don't think any of us have a solution. I think we are Punjab is traveling at a different speed to Balochistan and KPK. And those strains are beginning to show. And the only response that we have is kind of a clamped down response, not an actual response on how to balance out the growth story in Pakistan. And that's where I find it surprising that the army, who I recognize are very well organized, etc., they don't seem to have a response to that. They've come out with a response that you've also seen, SIFC, which is again the same story, that we are begging for money rather than trying to solve our domestic problems. So how do you find that argument credible, or do you think I'm reaching too far?
Well, clearly, you can't change the chemistry of Pakistani politics, and you can't change the main ingredients. But again, being an optimist, I tend to see the possibility and the opportunity for that change, the change that you are talking about, and that is desirable within the country. I think the military has the ability to nudge the political system and to hold the political system accountable and to make it transparent while making itself accountable and transparent too, because that is how it wins public support. But you raised another issue which Pakistan has failed to address, which is that there is an imbalance in the administrative structure of the state, the size of the provinces, and therefore their political influence is totally imbalanced in terms of population, in terms of wealth, etc. I think every time the proposal is raised to reorganize the country in a different way, it is squelched. Or it takes off in a different tangent, which would be more dangerous, which is to create language-based provinces. A simple solution might be the one that was adopted in Nigeria. Remember, they had a civil war. They have the equivalent of our divisions, our states, within the Federation of Nigeria. Pakistan has I think we've just increased the number of divisions. It used to be 31 in the past. Maybe I think it's 32 now, with Chakwal having been made into a division. So whatever, Afghanistan has a similar structure, many small provinces. I think having smaller provinces allows governance to be closer to the people, not at a distant provincial capital. Responsibility rests with the people, and it creates a more balanced political structure. And then you can get rid of all the accusations of Punjabi dominance, etc., etc. Because currently you can't escape that. Even within the military, 62% or whatever is Punjabi, 14% Pakhtun. Right. And so you have to keep that in mind, that it affects people's thinking when they look at an institution. And when I look back in 1971, the whole Pakistan army in East Pakistan was called the Punjabi army. Yeah. Because that's what they thought it was, even though it wasn't. So that could be one way in which the military can nudge the politicians to agree to rebasing their political structures. But it's difficult. It's difficult because they have created their fiefdoms on the basis of the current provincial structures, and they would be very loath to give way to those. Now, as you know, the government has recently released a new 5-year plan. And the question is, will it be implemented? First of all, will it be read? And will people understand it? When I worked with Mahbub Haque, one of my primary goals was to help him publicize what the 6th 5-year plan was. Right. And before it was released, so that people could give their feedback. And I suggested to him that he shouldn't invite the business leaders from Karachi to come to Islamabad, but he should call and say, I'd like to come to Karachi and talk to you and get your views on what we should be doing. And then share whatever basic framework that he could with them so that there was feedback and a loop was created. Same way, I suggested he go to the National Defense College, which used to be in Ayub Hall in Pindi in those days, and have a meeting there and my simple briefing for him was, I said, please don't refuse to answer any question.
Right.
Whatever question you are asked, you should answer honestly and fully and truthfully. And the feedback I got was incredible. The military officers that were in that hall said they'd not seen a bureaucrat or a government official been so frank with them. He was sharing their experience, his views, and they then walked away thinking, well, now we understand what he's trying to do. So, did the government do something like this before it launched its current 5-year plan? You may know better than me. If I'd been there, I would have said, don't launch anything till you've socialized it, till you've talked to the students, till you've talked to the labor leaders, till you talk to the religious groups, till you talk to the provincial groups. Invite them, go to them, invite them to come and see you in the provinces, in the small towns, in the chambers of commerce, and get their feedback, and then make sure you reflect some of that in the final plan. But it was probably written by someone very smart, like my friend Hassan Iqbal, and that was it. So it won't have roots. That's my fear. I hope it succeeds.
Yeah. Let me just close by, because I know you have to go. You mentioned deconstructing the geography of the country or the politics of the country by this thing. It reminds me of something that my father said to me a long time ago when we were young and radical and supporting Bhutto. He told me, he said, you will regret having given up the one unit. What you are talking about right now, if we go to the construct of the divisions being provinces, we're kind of setting up a one unit that Ayub Khan set up, right? We're kind of going back in that direction. Bhutto slashed that very quickly and established this federation. Now with the federation there, as the Punjabi, for example, would I want my province to be downsized? So you have to get consensus of the federating units. That's a big issue. At the same time, you're right, the military could nudge situation in that direction. But I think they're also very reactive. That's I keep coming back to this, that who's shaping the vision of the country? And I go back to when you look at Nehru or Ambedkar or those people, they did shape the vision of the country. And they did it very deliberately, very carefully, very thoughtfully. And they kind of came up with something that is still lasting and sticking. And again, I remind you, look at the way Manmohan Singh just died. The adulation that he got and the simplicity with which he lived, which is in contrast to our people, that they never get the adulation and they don't even live simply. So the issue is just this, can the military or whoever it is achieve that nudging that is required? What they do is they react to the situation. They don't like one leader, they bring another one. They don't like another, they bring another one. But they don't kind of nurture the situation or allow these leaders to grow. Or even, for example, what I write in my reform agenda, maybe we should shorten the term of the parliament from 5 years to 3 years, because we need more frequent elections for leadership to emerge. At the same time, the military did put in local government twice. But now, these politicians have obviated the need for local government, and we're not going in the direction of local government, which could be a substitute for what you're saying. So I come back to this final question to you. There's a big tussle in our thinking between the military as well as the civilian side. There's no consensus. What is the role of the local government? What is the role of elections? What is the role of negotiation? What is the role of mediation? What is the role of the parliament? I don't think we are clear on any of these, or do you think we are?
First of all, in answer to your big question, is it possible? I say yes, it is possible, and yes, we can.
Okay.
Pakistan has the wherewithal, and Pakistan can develop these institutions, and it can put itself on the path. The military does have mechanisms for internal think tanking, as it were, and they've now reportedly also set up an economics unit at the ISI, and Army headquarters. They're looking at economics also. That's good and bad. It's good because then it'll help them understand the nuts and bolts of how an economy functions, which was often not the case. But it's bad because it's taking them off their primary path, and it will detract from their ability to manage themselves better. which they need to do. There's always room for improvement in internal management of any military. I've seen it in the United States, and but there has to be a desire for that introspection. That has to emerge from within. I'll give you a good example. When Jim Mattis was the commander CENTCOM, he put together a task force and invited me to join it, which was looking at the future of CENTCOM. And I said to him, I'm unfit for it because I'm not, I've never served in the US government or in the Pakistan government. I've never served in the military. And he said, yes, but you know the region that CENTCOM covers. And so we had a very high-powered group, including Michelle Flournoy, David Ignatius from the Washington Post. We had Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, and various other people who had managed the Pentagon and others in their lifetime. And we produced a report, but the basic remit was very simple. And this is my example of how things can get done. It was the future of CENTCOM, doing more with less. So the fiscal part, the spending part is really critical in a lot of this. You talk about the devolution of power to local bodies. That was a kind of sop that was given to the people of Pakistan by different dictators, including Musharraf. But you also know much better than I do, Nadeem, that the fiscal authority that they needed at the local level in order to be independent and make their decisions. The way the county government, where I live in Fairfax, one of the richest counties in America, it provides for its own education system, it provides for its own roads, it provides for its own infrastructure, because it taxes real estate at a realistic rate. You know that. And it has the resources. The central government isn't saying, we will take the resources, you make the decision. That it doesn't work that way. You have to devolve responsibility to where it belongs, to the people, to the local thanas, the communities, the tehsils, the districts, the divisions, and then build on that rather than from the top down. So, I know that it looks bleak, but when you squint your eyes and you look into the future, there is a glimmer of hope always, and I'm always hoping to go towards that for whatever part of my life remains ahead. But
thank you very much, Shuja.
The conversation. Thank you, Nadeem.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful talking to you, and this is only the beginning of our conversation, because I think there's a lot of brain to pick there. There's a lot of stuff that we have to pick there.
Well, I don't know, but
what we do, what we are trying to do is let the young people hear from people like you, and who don't have access to information that you cull out. So these young people watch this and they'll probably be very excited and they'll come up with questions. Inshallah, we'll do it again. But thank you very much. Your perspective has been very, very informative. And your optimism, even though I don't share it, is infectious. Thank you very much, Shuja.
Well, thank you, Nadeem. And the youth make me optimistic.